Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our 2000 Years Ago book club. Today, we are going to chat as well, about chapters 6 and 7. And things are a little bit different today. First, I want to say hi. Hi, Nicole.
Hey, Daniel. Fancy seeing you here.
Ah, yeah, and if you're watching this, you obviously realizing that we are not in the same room. As life will take us, we are in different places. And I am all the way here in Mexico, getting ready for the World Spiritist Congress. And Nicole is holding up the fort at home. But nevertheless, we are committed. So we are going to make this happen. Right, Nicole?
Absolutely. And fair warning, you hear that I'm a little under the weather. I also have two sick kids at home. So at some point in the evening, I might disappear. But fret not. This will be teamwork. Sometimes we have other folks joining us. Looks like tonight it's just going to be us. But I am excited to talk about our next chapter. So let's dig in.
Let's dig in. Today's conversation is about chapter 6 called The Abduction and chapter 7, Preaching by Lake Tiberias. And as usual, we're going to do a brief recap and then we can jump into the details of the chapter. And Nicole,
By the way, I need to share something with everybody out there because, I'm a bit of a nerd. And what I found really helpful, Daniel is still using his trusted online version of the book. I, however, have gone to a new level of geekdom with my book, and I have put tabs. You see all these beautiful, colorful tabs all over my book. So now each chapter is noted because what happened last week is I wanted to go back. Remember, we were talking at the end of chapter 5 about sort of some patterns that I'd observed, but I was having a really hard time getting to all the chapters. So the nerd and teacher in me wants to share this little tip. I have these little tabs that I stuck on the inside of my book, and now I can mark things, I can go to things, and it'll be a lot easier to find. So nerd tip, book club nerd 101. But enough about my nerdiness. The abductions.
Well, I would say that that's how you really study things. That's wonderful. I got to be honest with you. I'm a little jealous. I'm a little jealous of those little markers there. I will have
I know. Show off your Kindle.
All right. So the abduction. So this is an interesting chapter, as all the chapters are, because the plot keeps on twisting. As we might recall from chapter 5, that's the chapter in which Publius meets Jesus and we have the cure for their kid, right? Flavia. And they get back home and Publius has this, setback of that. Maybe it wasn't Jesus after all, but they also get the news from their beloved friends in Rome that everything is well, and they're looking forward then to packing things up and making their way back to Rome, because what they have come to do in Palestine, which was to help their daughter feel better, has been accomplished. So they're ready to go. Or are they? Because that's when chapter 6 comes in. And as you have correctly surmised by the title, The Abduction, something incredibly horrible takes place. And, and what takes place here is, you might remember that they had two kids, right? Flavia and Marcus. Marcus gets abducted. He literally gets kidnapped by one of our old characters from earlier on, Andre of Georgias. He has been in cahoots, we find out, with one of the servants in the house. You might remember that we had talked about before Anna and Semele. Semele, who has been taken to Marcus, is actually connected to Andre of Georgias, who had his kid flogged and then sent to slavery by Publius. And so as she gains their trust, she eventually connects with Andre again when at the end of the week, and Andre asks her to basically drape the kid in a little bundle and sneak him in the night after giving some sleeping potions and she dresses up in one of the garments from her boss, so it looks like it's a Roman woman passing a bundle to a Roman man, which is Andre. And so at night, as they plan, they are able to sneak Marcus out of the house and pass it on to Andre, whose goal is to make that kid, the kid which is the son of Senator Publius, his personal slave, much the same way that Publius made his kid a slave too. But it gets worse. It gets worse. It doesn't stop there. Who catches a glimpse of what's going on? Our friend Sulpicius. Sulpicius, who is very suspicious, sees the Roman garments and thinks that Livia is actually having an affair with the governor, Pilate. Because of the Roman garments, he thinks that's actually happening. So all that venom and all that gossip that he was trying to do, he feels like now he actually gets a validation, and that just kind of makes the plot twist even more. So next day he goes talk to next day our family wakes up to the incredible news that Marcus is gone. They're all desperate. They do all the searchy party thing. They try to do everything that they can. They can't find the kid. Remember, they have a lot of means, so they send a lot of people out. And Publius has some slaves slashed again because he believes that they're complicit or could have helped it. Sulpicius comes back, to make a long story short, talks to Publius and saying, no, let me check this out. I might have something for you. And he comes back and does the ultimate gossip, saying that there had been a case before of a Roman woman who had an affair with another politician of the time, and basically he blurts out and says, I think that Livia is having an affair with Pilate, right? And as he does that, something really interesting happens. Publius, who's now more doubtful, basically says, you know what, he keeps his cool and says, we can no longer be friends. I appreciate all the service that you had and everything else, but we can't be friends. Please go away. You're no longer be a servant in this household for telling me these lies and these things, right? So he does all the right things, but the truth is there is something that lingers in his heart, and the doubt about Livia's loyalty and fidelity to him lingers on. And at the end of the day, that's how we basically end chapter 6. Does that make sense, Nicole? Is there anything else that you feel like you might want to add?
No, I think it was a great summary. I say let's dig into some of the things that were juicy and meaty, and also things and patterns that we noticed in the chapter. So this isn't the juiciest, actually it is a juicy detail, but something that we've noted before is the description of what it was like to be in Capernaum and in Galilee and what the landscape looked like. I know this come up a couple of times. I, and you too, have had the pleasure of actually being in Capernaum and visiting some of these places. And so I love the description, and I'm literally on page 97, the first page of the chapter, where it says, at the time of Christ, Galilee was a huge granary that supplied almost all of Palestine. In those days, the water level of the beautiful lake of Gennesaret was not as low as it is today. The entire surrounding land was irrigated by numerous springs and canals. That is not the picture that we see now. And even if you, watching this video, you Google the landscape, you go on, a satellite image, you see a really arid, dry desert. So to imagine this land so lush and so filled with fruit, I mean, the description on that first page just paints this very lush oasis. And it talks about how the abundance of fish is why the Sea of Galilee was really named that, why it was named the Sea of Galilee rather than the Lake of Galilee, which also makes sense why we hear all these fishing stories and why it was so confusing for me being at the edge of the Sea of Galilee going, Jesus went fishing here? Like, what happened? So I just wanted to point that out because I I love that description. And I think what's interesting about this part, if when we go out to page 98, it really explains to us why Jesus chose Galilee, why he chose, even more specifically, Capernaum, which I think, if I remember the tour guide right, he called Capernaum, which is what it was called at that time, which is so beautiful and just has like a nice ring to it. And I'm probably mispronouncing it. But just such a beautiful place. And it says that Jesus found the affection of devoted and valiant hearts. And it was there that the spirit world found the best elements for forming the memorable school where the divine master would exemplify his teaching. So not only was this lush land, but the people were virtuous and natural and simple. So the simplicity of the people of the land and the lush, beautiful climate, so sort of people had what they needed. It made life not easy by any means, right? But it made life fulfilling, and it created these humble, happy servants that were ready to receive the gospel of Jesus. And I thought it was such a cool detail that I'd never thought about. You know, I never really thought about, well, why Jerusalem? Why Capernaum? And this explains it right here on page 98. So I thought that was cool.
I thought it was great that you thought about this, because it is true. It seems that the message of God, or the spiritual message, is generally more readily picked up by those who are simpler in their hearts and minds, right? Those who are so-called like sophisticated and highly educated sometimes have a tendency to overemphasize their own abilities and believe in something greater than themselves. They want to believe that they are the masters, the shakers and bakers of their own fortune, that they can figure things out on their own, and they need not an external force to really be able to make the world go. So it's a very interesting description. I really love that too. And you know, one of the other things that I thought it was interesting too, Nicole, along those lines, which is not that which is not that far away. I think it's a paragraph down or so. He says that there were synagogues in all towns of the region, so that the lessons on the law could be conducted on the Sabbath, the days individuals were dedicated exclusively to rest for the body and to the activities of the spirit, right? In these small synagogues, anyone who wished to speak was allowed to do so. But Jesus preferred the pleasing temple of nature for spreading his teachings. I thought it was interesting because I think there's a very beautiful symbolism in there too as well, which is, first I should start by saying like, wow, look at that, a synagogue that anybody, or like a temple that anybody can come in and just take the word and say whatever they want to, right? That's already a little bit different from what we nowadays are accustomed to when it comes to organized religion, right? Because I think we have made organized religion out of religion. We have come with a set of rules and hierarchy and things that sometimes take away from the message. But at that time, people could walk in and say anything. But even then, Jesus preferred to do it in nature and not in the temples and not in the synagogues, even though he was a Jewish man, and told us basically that, right? And I think that to be a very beautiful symbolic point about spirituality and connecting with God can happen anywhere and should happen anywhere, and not just in temples of worship. I'm not saying that temples and worship are not good and they're not helpful. They might actually help us concentrate, but we don't need to be in a certain place to connect with God. And I thought that simple line there reminded me of that a little bit.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that we're talking, well, people might be watching this video on various days, but you and I, we're here today, Wednesday, October 2nd, and we are on the heels of Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. And so for all of our Jewish friends who might be watching this, Shana Tova, which I think means Happy New Year in Hebrew. But I think it's an interesting symbolic opportunity to sort of talk about the interconnection of faiths, right? Because I think often when people think of Jesus, And what you just said made me think of this. You know, he was a Jewish man and a man of Jewish faith. And while, you know, we now think of Jesus as a Christian, he was a Jew. And here we are, you know, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. And I thought it would only be appropriate to wish people Shana Tava, a happy New Year, because that's what Jesus would have been celebrating. If today fell in his days, in the days of a luscious and filled with water Capernaum and Jerusalem. So anyway, just a little sidestep.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point for sure. Right. He didn't set out to create a movement or a religion. He just worked with the people and what we had. And we're the ones that generally do that. Even the term Christian didn't really come about until much later on, until he had already, resurrected and gone to heaven, so to speak. So it's a very interesting perspective. That it's a great point. It's a great point. We all work for the same God. We're just in different departments.
Same boss. So speaking of this boss and speaking of Jesus, it is the next part in the story, and you give a great summary of this. But we see that Livia is thinking about going to see Jesus in Simon's house. This is Simon Peter. Is that correct, Daniel? I get my.
Yes, that's the. But she also has an uncle that has come from Samaria, which is another piece of land up north, and who wants to go see Jesus, right? And the interesting piece is that Samaria.
Anna has an uncle, right, Daniel? Anna's uncle, not
yes.
Livia's uncle. Okay. Just wanted to make sure we clarify for everybody listening.
Sorry for that. Yeah, Anna. Right. And so it is interesting too, because it also shows that folks from Samaria, the Samaritans, were not very well accepted by the Jews in general, right? There's a little something there. And and Anna's uncle is coming down to see Jesus, and Livia, kindly enough, is touched by that idea, and we can see Livia getting closer and closer to the idea of Christ. And she even gives Anna some money to take to her uncle, so that they can have a little bit of an easier time traveling and doing all that. That's also right. And this is a chapter also. This is the part also when we learn more about the intricate dealings that Semele, the other house slave, has with Andre, and the plan that is concocted for the kidnapping. We also know that she has some ties to his family, and she owes his family different things. And so this is her way of making it even, right? So she's not excited about the prospect of doing it, but nevertheless, she's going to do it anyways, right? Because she's hoping to put that debt behind her. And what a difficult decision to do, right? When you know you're doing something that you shouldn't, and yet you do that anyways, to benefit you somehow.
But the interesting thing I was going to say, on page 102, sort of 3 paragraphs from the bottom, it talks about that she is cooperating in that sinister plot, that she felt she was doing nothing more than paying off many of her debts. Nothing more than paying off debts. It actually isn't until page 106 where, at the top of the page, Semele finally realizes the extent of her deed, but terrified of the possible consequences of the crime, she collected herself to hide her guilt and the terrible secret. So in the moment, it strikes me as so surprising, because this woman has been caring for this little boy and clearly has affection for him, right? Like, she's been with him, cared for him, yet in planning the abduction, she doesn't think she's doing anything more than repaying debt. And it isn't until people are whipped and beaten that she actually goes, hey, wait a minute, this might not be good. It just struck me. This part really didn't sit well with me, because I thought, how can that be? Of course she knows she's doing something wrong. And we don't have to dig too deep into that, but for me, it just it was a sticking point.
Yeah. Yeah, I read that part too as her trying to rationalize her actions and say it's no big deal, right? Like we do. Like she knows
Yeah.
it's not great, but she rationalizes it. But then later on, she sees the results, and there's no way that she can hide behind that shield that she created, right? And you're very right, because we can read this quickly and forget that she cared for Marcus on a daily basis. She has a
Yeah.
relationship with him, right? And the kid fully trusted her, right? And she does that. So really, really big action there.
I thought it was interesting, and I'm on the on the bottom of page 105. I think it's interesting, as always, the juxtaposition of how Publius Lentulus reacts and how Livia reacts, right? So Publius is described on the bottom of page 105 like a madman, taking every possible measure with the authorities, you know, whereas Livia is overcome with indescribable anguish, and we see her turning to prayer in a lot of moments where the two of them are confronted with the same situation. He turns to pride and anger. She turns to prayer and love. And I mean, I have not hidden the fact that I am Team Livia in this book. And once again, you know, in the midst of this horrible anguish, Livia has this amazing insight. You know, slavery was not abolished in the United States until very recently. It was not abolished in Latin American countries until very recently. We still know there are places where there are indentured servants. Yet here, 2,000 years ago, Livia, you know, really talks about, is questioning slavery on the bottom of page 106. She, you know, talks about that there is maternal anguish, and that, you know, even slaves who are being beaten, they are somebody's children. They deserve dignity. They deserve love. That, you know, no mother wants to see their child yanked from their loving arms or be sold to, like, a human trader. And here's Publius again, man. This man is, like, wearing me thin. And he says, Livia, your suffering is filling you with odd thoughts. And he goes on to say, how could you even think of such an absurd equality of rights between Roman patricians and wretched slaves? But Livia, you know, this woman is a woman before her time. And her love and her kindness, her equality, her belief in all people is beautiful. And even though this is a really hard chapter to read, especially as a mother, it's a hard chapter to read. I find hope in her kindness and her love and her perseverance.
Yeah, and so I think you say a couple of things that are really interesting. One of them is the arc, right? Or that the both characters are doing. Like the more we read about them, we see like Publius digging himself a hole, right? And making choices that are questionable. And things are getting harder. And the more things are getting harder, we see Livia actually rising and going the other way. They are really being drawn apart. Like if we were to draw arches, they would be like moving away from each other. And I agree with you. I think this is an interesting point, because remember how Livia was always caught in difficult situations, like with Pilate before when he was making advances, but she was always kind and was able to kind of navigate that with a certain flair and kindness. But this is the first time that we see her being like direct, right? When he makes a distinction, the next paragraph she says, "You are wrong," replied her, right? With indescribable bitterness. This is the first time she's coming out and saying no, right? And this is this is like a big deal, like it especially for 2,000 years ago, like a woman speaking like that to a senator.
Team
Rome,
Livia.
right? So definitely Team Livia, right? And then because of that, he eventually offers the punishment. He orders the punishment of the slaves to be stopped, right? Because he's just vicious. He's just having it go and go and go, right? Yeah. And again, you know, and the interesting thing about Publius too, like a couple of pages down, is there's this paragraph that starts with "deep down." It goes, "Deep down, he felt he had no enemies in Palestine, except for Saul, son of Andre, whom he believed to be at peace in his father's home, he had never humiliated the self-respect of any Israelite. In fact, he had given everyone the best of his attention, right? That's the story that he's telling himself, right? That is the perception that he has based on his own privilege of how he is. I mean, he's like, why is this happening to me? I have done nothing wrong, basically, right? And we see that the opposite is almost true all the time. Not to say that he's a bad person, but his view of himself does not align with the view that we are offered of him, right? And so that's one of the things that oftentimes leads me to think, like, how do we translate this lesson to ourselves? Like, how do we know who we are? Are we also having a case with the Publius where we think that we are nicer or better than we are? Not that we should flog ourselves and beat ourselves over the head, but do we take enough time to reflect on our actions and whether they align with what we think we are? I thought that was an interesting paragraph there because it was really his perspective, right? Whereas like other people and his servants and everybody else might offer an alternative version of that story.
Yeah. And yet again, like as this goes on, you know, Livia always takes the opposite road. And even in this moment of unthinkable pain, your child is gone, right? She's just received her other child back. Flavia, who almost passed away from leprosy, is cured by Jesus. And now her baby is gone. And even in that moment, right, on page 109, she calls upon, it says, the poor woman had called upon the last resources of her maternal energies to offer those words of hope and consolation to her husband. God knew, however, of her unspeakable inner torment during those anguishable moments, and only her pure sentiment of selflessness and love could transform her fragility into strength of comforting her husband's anguish and heart in these distressing circumstances. Like, this woman's a saint. Like, I feel like there should be a Saint Livia. I'm starting a petition. Saint Livia for president.
Yeah. And here we are, right? Like, she has lost her son, right? And she's having to deal with that pain, put it aside, and basically console her husband who is having different kinds of perceptions and feelings, right? So it's truly like the emotional burden she's carried is an extremely high one at a point in time. So yeah, so I think this chapter tells a lot about this character arch, right? That Livia and Publius are doing and how they are really going in different directions. I think the next chapter is further evidence of that. Sorry for that. When we really see how Livia makes some choices that are unfathomable for Publius, right? But before we end, just a couple of more comments. We end this chapter. A couple of more comments. This is also where the conversation takes place between Sulpicius and Publius. Publius shows him away, but the bug is in his mind, right? He starts
to that doubt.
Think about everything.
Planting the seeds of doubt.
Yes, indeed.
I cut you off. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, anything else you want to say about chapter 6 before we move to 7?
I just want to say that it's really hard that you're, thousands of miles away and we're having this conversation. I feel like we have sort of a natural rhythm to our conversation. Even when we're not in the same room, but sort of in the same city, this has been hard, especially with a delay. So all of you watching remotely, I'm not sure if you're experiencing the same delay, but it's hard to sort of find a groove. And Daniel and I are trying to figure out what is the right pauses, like how do we make this happen? Because there's a slight delay. So apologies to all of our friends who are watching this because it's feeling a little clunky, but we're making it work. And this next chapter is worth it to make it work. So give us a summary, Dr. Dan.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Nicole, because I'm struggling with that as well. And I don't know if it's my internet here at the hotel, but it's definitely cutting off in a couple of parts and just makes it hard to follow. But just like you said, we keep on going, just like Team Livia. Livia keeps on going, like the honey badger. She doesn't stop.
And the poor people watching, I mean, the good news is you're clearly noticing there's germs everywhere. I've got tissues, Daniel's coughing. The great news about this book club is you get no germs, no cooties from either of us, even though I'm running a fever and Daniel's coughing over there. You are completely safe.
We're gonna cough
You
together.
have to sort of bear through our coughing, but
together.
germ safe.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Oh, before we move on to chapter 7, did you have a different name for chapter 6, the abduction?
I did not, because I kept thinking there's so many ways that I could go. I was actually thinking about the continued grace and strength of Livia. But abduction is like so clear, right? Like it's really what it's about. But to me, what stood out in this chapter is the continued compassion from, the conversations with Anna that she's having, the generosity of giving away the money, the rising to sort of be her highest self, even in most difficult moments. All of this to me is really about like the continued grace of Livia. If I had to rename the chapter, that is what it would be.
Great. And chapter 7 then is officially called Preaching by Lake Tiberias. But if I were to still move from Nicole's tool belt, I would say that I would rename it to Livia Goes Full Jesus on this one.
I don't know if I was going to go Livia Goes Full Jesus, but I was going to go Livia plus Jesus equals happiness.
Mine's more dramatic, so
It totally is, and very hip.
But anyway, so this is an interesting chapter because in this chapter, Pilate comes back to help search for Marcus. So the search continues. It's been a couple of days. The challenge here is that Publius still behaves well in public, but his trust of Livia is gone. So we now have that arc that we were talking about fully separating, right? Whereas before they could see things differently, they came together and overlapped. Now he's really taking off, right? He's dipping and she's rising, and he's not opening himself up to her. He's like doing revisionist history where he's now starting to think that everything that she did before had an ulterior motive. Maybe she is having an affair, that kind of stuff. And in the middle of all that, Livia has a conversation with Anna, again, her trusty companion there, who says, do you want to go see Jesus? Because I'm pretty sure that he will help you feel better about this. And she goes, and if you want to, I can help you sneak like by the flight of night into like Simon Peter's house where Jesus is, so that nobody sees that you're going, right? So she's like really trying to be helpful there because she truly believes that that Livia, who she cares for quite a bit, right, is in need, right? And they have a frank conversation about. This is where it's really beautiful. They have a conversation about status and privilege, right? Livia comes out and says, I don't believe, even though I was born to a rich family and I inherited a lot of money and I married to a Roman senator, I mean, she's got everything technically that the world wants, right? She has easy fortune, she says, and status. She does not believe, more and more, she knows in her heart that there really is no separation between classes, so to speak, that every human is human.
It's beautiful. Right? Because at that point, she says on page 118 that the rights that birth bestowed on me have not been able to shield me from the trials that fate has brought to me. Yes. So great. Like, even though I was born into nobility, life is real.
Yeah.
And she goes on, and it's so much more beautiful because she then goes on and says, so you must realize that even though I'm a patrician and you are a servant, our hearts are no different. We share the best sentiments of sisterhood, which opens the door to a tender understanding that is a heaven in the sad days of life. Like, so beautiful. So, so beautiful.
And then the next sentence, I also have it highlighted, Nicole. Contrary to the education I received, in my own mind, I've always believed that all people are family, children of a common origin, right? So here is she bucking all the social training she's received to believe she's better than other people, right? And she's saying, I don't buy that. I don't believe in any of that, which comes at a great risk, right?
Yeah. But it's so cool. And at the risk of, reading the whole book to the people listening, Anna's response is equally beautiful. And it's so interesting that Livia's words match the master's, because she said, your words move me, not just because they come from your lips, which I've always listened to with affection and veneration, but also because the prophet of Nazareth has said the very same things in his sermon. So interesting.
Yeah, which is another interesting piece too, right? That reminds us that we are a continuation of our previous lifetime. So clearly, Livia brings all this virtue from all this learning and incredible development that she has done in her past lifetime. So she brings a lot of that baggage, so to speak, a lot of that knowledge with her, which is something that we already knew because of Publius' dreams, right? Remember the talking to the judge and everything else, and Livia basically bails him out, right, and decides to come back with him. So it's kind of a beautiful thing to see how there's a continuous process of evolution. Some of the things that we bring, that we know, are not necessarily, they stick even from life to life, right? Even when we receive education that tells us otherwise, her certainty that all people are the same kind of remains central to the core of who she is, which I think is a really beautiful thing, right? And this is the part in which the whole idea of visiting Jesus really starts to take hold, right? But what I really think about that's really interesting is she says these interesting words that Nicole just read, which basically go back to the contemporary world, right? So having fame and fortune and power are not necessarily, the requirements for happiness, right? She has all of that. She even has a husband that loves her, but she has lost a child after basically healing another one, right, who she thinks was lost. And her husband is shutting her out, even though he has no reason to do that whatsoever, right? So she is suffering quite a bit. And then none of that, as she described, can be ameliorated, can be mitigated because of her status and her fortune. Quite the opposite. She has even more responsibilities, right? Um, and we're going to see that when she finally gets out of the house and visits Anna's family, and she finds this atmosphere of simplicity, she shares with us on how great it is for her not to have to worry about all the social, customs and things.
But here's something interesting that as a mother, I don't understand. On the top of page 120, she talks about that his charity has been enough in the case of my daughter, who is healthy and strong today thanks to his mercy. I shall seek only comfort for my afflicted heart. As a mother, I keep going no, ask for your kid. Dude, Livia, you and I were on the same page up until page 120. Why are you only asking for comfort for your afflicted heart? Ask for your kid. I don't know. Help me understand this, Daniel, because as a mother, -1 point for Team Livia right here for me.
No. I struggle with the same passage. I'm like, why wouldn't you ask? He's right there, right? And I think that the piece here, it only makes her even more like Team Livia than she already is. I think that she already knows. I think that her spiritual side of her knows that what's actually happening and that they have to go through this challenge, right? So that Publius can learn. And so I think that the spiritual part of her, or her in the spiritual sense, is aware of these trials. Because remember, we know this through our studies that at night, the spirit, who we are, detaches from our physical body and oftentimes continues our spiritual life until the body is rested and can function again, because our body cannot function constantly. It needs a break. And it's no doubt that a spirit at such a level of Livia is in contact with great spiritual mentors and guides who are no doubt helping her see what's happening in the choices that are made. she might not be remembering that on a physical level when she comes back to her physical body, right? But part of her knows that she needs to go through this, right? And I think we're going to see that a little bit later too when Jesus talks to her. But yes, I think not being as evolved or steadfast or resolute or faithful as Livia, I would certainly ask, right? Because I would still be challenged with my here and now mentality, right? My physical self would win over my spiritual self, so to speak. Does that make sense to you?
It does up here. It doesn't right here, but yes.
Yeah, right. And this is the interesting part, right? Like where she now says, she actually, this is another evidence of the arc that we were talking about, Publius and Livia, right? Anna offers her help to go see the Messiah, like right in the flight of night, hidden, and she says, you know what? No, I need to go see him in public, right? Which is exactly what Publius was asked to do. So she says, I will put some different clothes so I don't call attention to myself, but I will go there, right? And so she is in that pivotal moment in that existence where she's ready to take a public stand, so to speak, about her faith and what she believes, right? Which Publius was unable to do. Like the spiritual side of Livia, so to say, is speaking louder than the physical side of Livia, right? And whereas Publius is on the other side of the equation. And I thought that was really noteworthy because remember that Jesus tells Publius on that meeting, like, it would have been better if you have come during the day, right, in public. And here is Livia doing exactly that. And not only that, that would be a beautiful thing, right? She goes to a humble and simple house beforehand and stays with people, showing that she already gets the message of equality and kindness, even though she has not technically ever seen Jesus, right? Which is really cool, I think. Gets me excited. So
I agree.
And when she gets there, she has a great time with the family, and they go and to the lake, right, to the Sea of Galilee, where they always go. There's hundreds of people, and there's a beautiful description of the day and how the sunset was beautiful and really sets you in the mood. And then it describes the boat, Peter's boat, coming from afar, right, and then landing, and then here comes Jesus, right? And he's going to do his talk again at the end of the day after the work is done. And he starts to do a beautiful passage that I think many of us are familiar with. And guess what? She has come in the day where he is delivering the Sermon on the Mount. So she comes at a pretty important time, right? And so she starts listening to all that and realizes that it's a pretty big day. As a matter of fact, like, around there in the middle, and I can't tell you the page number, sorry for that, Nicole, but Emmanuel sets us up to say that a really interesting thing about the speech that Jesus is about to give. He says, the master began a sermon of unmistakable beauty, and his words appeared to touch the most hardened hearts. It seems as though the sermon resounded all over the boundaries of Galilee, echoing beyond throughout the ages, modeled beforehand to carry on in the world along with eternity itself. Right?
And that is the last paragraph on page 122.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful setup, right? It's like as if that moment was a special moment that was prepared and that it was uttered in those words there, but those teachings in that moment would stay in history for the rest of times, right? And it does, because it's the Sermon on the Mount, right? Which is the speech, the part of the New Testament that Gandhi, if I'm not mistaken, says that if everything else that's written in the world were lost, but only the Sermon on the Mount survived, we would not have lost much. And I think it's a beautiful a beautiful homage to this beautiful poem, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Right? And then after that, what could only have been like such a powerful experience with all that beautiful energy, because they do talk about like the magnetism of the place and his words and his energy in general, right? So something that we get a glimpse of, and I think it's probably hard for us to understand unless we experience it. I myself am looking forward to experiencing an encounter such as this one. But the interesting piece to here is that the book brings us like very real life moments, right? So after the sermon is done, they go through all the questions, right? And people start talking. But it says here, maybe a couple of paragraphs down, Nicole, so maybe it's page 123 or 124. It was getting late, and some of the Lord's disciples decided to get some bread for those who were most in need of nourishment, right? So we witness here another important moment in history. The disciples understand that people don't want to go home because it's such a great atmosphere, just like we have sometimes when we're hanging out with friends and we just kind of linger. But it's getting late, and there's hundreds of people, and there's no Walmart around or a drive-through, and these people are hungry. And what if you get 400 or 300 or 500, how many hundreds people angry? That's always a problem, right? And so what do? We only have a couple of pieces of bread. And so we have here that beautiful moment of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes that we see in the Bible. And I think what I really like about that, and I'll shut up for a little bit, is I like the symbolism of that. I like the symbolism of when we bring our little, which is just a pieces of bread, right? God, and represented here by Jesus, spirituality, the cosmos, whatever you want to call, augments that, makes that enough when we are setting our very little to help others, right? So even we may not have the greatest abilities in the world, when we are offering what we got for others to help others, there will always be a multiplying effect by spirituality and God to help that accomplish, because those goals are nobles. And in fact, everybody eats, and Livia even describes that bread, the piece of bread, as almost like a magical experience in many different ways. So I thought that was a nice, beautiful symbolism in there.
I agree. And it's just so beautiful. And I love that, you know, a lot of these passages are passages that we know. We know the Sermon on the Mount. We've heard of the multiplication of the bread, the loaves and fishes. And we actually, most of us who have read the Bible and know some biblical stories, we know the Samaritan's question of, what must I do to enter your kingdom someday? So it's just really cool to read all that in the context of the story and how it all folded together. But I love this like brief moment that Livia and Jesus share, where on page 124, the ray of light from his eye to the figure of Livia sort of came up, and he looks at her and says, and you rejoice in our Father, for my words and teachings have touched your heart forever. Go and believe, for the time will come when I shall accept your sanctifying self-sacrifice. Just so beautiful. And, you know, we learn about sort of the lightness in Livia's soul and how that really lifts her up. And it's like there was a profound sensation of relief and comfort that flooded her, which is so good, because here comes Publius, you know, talk about raining on a parade. You see that conflict really rising up, and he becomes almost resentful and hurtful. I mean, he kind of throws a temper tantrum at the end of this chapter.
Mm-hmm. And before we go there, I just want to highlight the chapter, the paragraph after the one you read, because it says, these words were spoken in such a way that the senator's wife had no difficulty grasping their profound meaning for their distant future, right? So
yeah, I
love his prophetic words, because he says, you know, rejoice in our Father, for my words and teachings have touched your heart forever. So he's saying, I know that you are in an upwards arc. I can tell. You will never be the same. You've got this, right? But there will be tough times ahead, and she knows it, right? And she understands, again, to the point about not asking for help for Marcus, right? She understands that the profound meaning in their distant future. She knows, her soul knows, that there will be a lot of pain. that she has agreed to take on in this journey to try to help Publius, right? And it's a beautiful thing. And I think that segues perfectly to what you're saying. She goes back home, and who does she find? Fuming, being the angriest that he has ever been, according to her, right? And she remains steadfast and steady. This new encounter with Jesus has brought a certain sense of faith to her heart in her life, that even among his worst tempers, she is convinced that she has to do what she has to do, right? That they are drifting apart, that she has a tough a piece ahead, but she has to do it. She cannot be her. She cannot be true to herself. Right?
But I like that, like, whereas up until this moment, she has always been giving of herself. You know, she almost indulges his temper tantrums, I'm going to call them. But on page 126, my favorite sentence uttered by Olivia, which is, "Be still, Publius." Like, enough, stop it now. And I feel like it's a turning point for the relationship of her holding firm, loving boundaries. And, you know, I'm really excited because in just a couple of weeks, I get to do a lecture with a colleague of mine at the Spiritist Educator Conference about children and needs and behavior. And one of the things we know about behavior is that all behavior is the expression of a need. But just because somebody needs something doesn't mean you need to give it to them. And when somebody behaves inappropriately, it's okay to set firm, loving limits. And I feel like that is exactly what Livia does in this book. She sets a firm, loving limit and says, "Be still, enough already. Like, Jesus cured our daughter. I went to go see him. I understand you're upset, but enough." So I thought it was an interesting turning point in their relationship, or what I perceive to be a turning point. I haven't read ahead. This is as far as I am, so maybe it's not a turning point.
Yeah. And that's a great piece, because she's now fully connected, so to speak, right, with the spirituality, and she's really stepping herself, and she will no longer just cater to her husband's whims. She's going to stand by what's right. And as he leaves, after he throws another tantrum and says, "This is horrible. This is the worst trip that he's ever done," right? She is changing, and her mind returns back to the lake, and she imagines Jesus, because she's again seeking that connection. And she has this vision, right? And she sees him and hears him, and he says some beautiful prophetic words there in a way too, that are harbingers of things to come, that are not necessarily going to pan out well for her on a physical sense, right? He says, "Daughter," which is a beautiful thing, right? So he's bringing the affection of God to her, right? "Your eyes weep for the imperfections of the soul that our Father had this destined as a twin to yours." Like, you were suffering for your husband, right? Poetic language. "Do not expect anything but tears and suffering in this world, because it in suffering that our hearts again lift for heaven," right? And he says, "A time will come when you feel yourself at the pinnacle of suffering, when the pain will feel so great." And I think all of us feel that at one point in time in our lives. And he goes, "But do not doubt my mercy. Even though everyone may despise you, I will call you to my kingdom of divine hope, where you shall await your husband in the never-ending course of the centuries," right? And I think it's just a beautiful piece. You know, she gets disrupted, but there's still this connection. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that we see in spiritual transformation, so to say, is that we start valuing the spiritual, which is more of a long-term approach, than the physical, which is a short-term approach. And she understands that this life might yield quite a bit of suffering, but herself, her true life, her spiritual life, is really beginning to unfold before her. And that eventually, even if it takes centuries, as we know it does, right? Because remember, the beginning of the book, Emmanuel says, "I'm going to tell you a story about 2,000 years ago that brings me shame," and, so that hope, So it takes like many centuries after that for him to get the message that Olivia has already gotten by the time. But nevertheless, she waits and stays with him. It's such a beautiful thing, and such a beautiful thing to see that while he's still thinking at the earthly level, she has transcended and is beginning to think at the cosmic, like spiritual level.
So next time, are we reading 2 chapters or 3 chapters? I think it's 2, right? Because chapter 10 is really long, and it comes right before we go to part 2 of the book.
Yes. So you think, what do you think?
Right?
2 or 3? 2.
Chapter 10 is over 40 pages, and chapters 8 and 9 combined are also about 40 pages. So I feel like next week we should do chapters 8 and 9, and then the following week we will do chapter 10, which will then take us to the second part of the book. I don't know why there are 2 parts. I am sure I will find out, but I'm excited to get there. So again, thank you, Daniel, and thank you for everyone who watched this. I know it was hard. Audio was a little harder today. Daniel and I had a little bit of gap in our transfer, and you saw both of us sniffling and coughing and sneezing throughout. So if you made it this far, thanks for bearing with us. Join us next week for chapters 8 and 9, and I'll leave the final word to you, Daniel.
And thank you, Nicole, for helping me think about this and talk about this. It's always more pleasurable and goes so much deeper when you have somebody to talk to, and I'm so lucky that I can do that with you. I also want to invite folks to, obviously, who are watching this, that and remind them that they can also continue the conversation on our online forums at spiritismonline.org at any point in time, even a year from now. Those things are going to be there, and we can still engage and share share your thoughts with people.
And people really like social media too, Daniel. So why don't you tell them where they can find you on social media?
Yeah. So people can find us on Facebook. Just do facebook.com/Dan Assisi. You'll find my page. And if you also do facebook.com/Spiritist Institute, you will also find some news about Spiritism in general. The Spiritist Institute does things like Spiritism Online, which is this new endeavor that we're trying to get off the ground. So connect with us. The conversation does not have to be stopped here. It can continue on social media on spiritismonline.org. And thank you for watching and listening and being part of this with us. Even if we can't hear you right now, we hope to hear your voice somewhere.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, all the links that Daniel just mentioned will be in the comments. And if you happen to like podcasts, there will be some suggestions and recommendations for podcasts, including Spiritist Conversations, where you can hear Daniel connect with some pretty amazing folks and share some interesting stories. So all of those are ways for you to connect. We hope to see you around or hope to hear from you. Thanks for bearing with us. Have a beautiful day, and until next time, bye.